Um, you may have just seen the recording in progress button pop up. We are recording tonight's meeting. Welcome to our second large forum for the Newcastle County Comprehensive Plan 2050 process. My name's Jennifer Hurley, and I will be your overall facilitator for tonight's workshop. But we have many other people on the meeting who are going to be facilitating our breakout rooms. Tonight's agenda has two main parts. We're going to start with a presentation about key pieces of the analysis that have supported the development of the plan objectives and strategies. And then we'll spend about an hour in small group discussions. We're going to be talking about in those small group discussions, where and how, where in the county and in what pattern you think we should be growing, and getting your ideas about how to choose between different trade-offs that are related to some of the strategies that are proposed to include in the plan. After you have that hour in your small group, we'll wrap up by telling you about the next steps in the process and how you can stay involved. We really want there to be the maximum possibility for all of you to speak in tonight's event, and that's why we are doing this in the Zoom meeting format and why we are having the discussion in the breakout rooms instead of in the large room. We already have about 70 people on this meeting, and I think more than 200 registered for tonight's event. So we need those small breakout rooms to help you all be able to speak. I also want to let you know that all of the content from tonight, both the presentation material and the questions that we're going to be discussing in the small groups, are going to be available on the website for individuals to contribute later if you wish. So we are using the Zoom meeting format tonight. That means that everyone here has the ability to turn on and off your microphones and your videos. We're going to ask everyone to keep your microphones muted during the presentation. With this many people, it's really easy for the background noise to just be distracting to everyone. If you're here on a telephone, you can mute and unmute yourself with *6. The buttons for your video and your microphone are on the lower left if you are on a computer. And can you go to the next screen? And if you're on an iPad or a tablet, next slide, please, they'll be up at the top usually. We are also using the chat box for the questions. And note that you have the option of sending your chat to everyone in the meeting or to everyone in the meeting. Just make sure it's going to who you want it to. Next slide, please. So our ground rules for discussion tonight, we got started on time and we are getting you out of here by 8 o'clock tonight. To do that, we need to stay on topic. Please focus on the issues. We expect there will be some disagreement tonight. We want to hear different points of views. We just want to hear it about the issues and not about personalities. So no name calling or personal attacks. Please speak up. Everyone here has something to contribute, but be open to new ideas. We all have something to contribute, and I hope we all have something to learn also. This workshop is being recorded as I speak. It will be posted online afterwards, and the comments that you provide in the chat will also be saved and provided online. I'm going to hand off the presentation to Andrea, but before I do that, I just want to let you know that there's a lot of detail in this presentation, and we don't expect you to instantly know all of it. This is to help you have a productive conversation in your breakout rooms, but all of this content is available on the website and you'll be able to go back to it later. So during the presentation, feel free to take notes about ideas you have or things you want to talk about in your small group. And off to you, Andrea.
Actually, I'm going to be handing it right over to Rich. Rich is going to give the introduction. So
thank you.
Rich, please.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Richard Hall, and I'm the General Manager of the County Department of Land Use. And I want to thank the team that worked at putting all this together, Jennifer and other staff and folks we have working with us on this plan update. This is your 2050 update, so it's required every 10 years. And as Jennifer mentioned, there are a good number of slides. A lot of work has gone into that. So we're really trying tonight to maximize not taking any longer than we have to, respecting everyone's time. At the same time, I'm trying to give you some information, feedback on what we've heard, what the process is, where we are in the process, and then some analysis on scenarios that help us take what we've heard, form them into policies and weigh them, and talk about how they might fit in the comprehensive plan. So that's a simple way of saying there are a number of things we're going to show you, as Jennifer mentioned, that where we analyze some of the options going forward in the breakout groups. We'll give you all an opportunity in a smaller setting to weigh and talk about those. So a little bit of review here and status where we are, and then we'll get right into it. So here we go with the slide, how the plan relates to our future. So as I think several of you have been here before, the plan is a shared community vision for our future. And we're looking 30 years out. That's why we call this NCC 2050, because we're looking 30 years out from now. It establishes measurable objectives so we can track progress for our recommendations. It also serves as a coordinating tool for implementation with many partners, whether it's sister agencies in the county, at the state, even the federal government, other organizations, and with the community in general. A very important part of the plan is what's called the future land use map. And that is the part of the plan that has the most force of law. The plan is required by state law, and the future land use map is the most legalistic part of the plan. And your zoning and subdivision regulations, in other words, Unified Development Code, has to follow and be driven by the future land use map. Here we are with the process and timeline where we are. You are here kind of map, if you will, because this is a long effort. We've now been at it for about a year. We've done a lot of outreach and engagement, and really appreciate many of you that have worked with us on this to date, and really hoping you stay with us for the long term. Building a plan is certainly a marathon and not a sprint. So we're on phase 3, kind of in the middle there, the blue part, and we're finishing up what we're calling the policy framework. And you're going to see results of that tonight, and we're trying to get feedback tonight to move us into the next step. So that's what the scenario planning analysis is for, and to help us get to refining these goals to objectives and strategies. The next step in the fall will be to issue a draft of the plan. We hope to have that staff draft done by the end of the calendar year. And after that, it'll go through the formal adoption. Lastly, before I turn it over to Andrea, is what we've heard. I say that we have issued summary documents and such. We're not going to go through every one of those now. We had a lot of outreach in the summer and fall last year, and then we've had 5 what we refer to as deep dive workshops. You can see them up on the screen now. And the last one, I believe, was in May. So we had 5 of these workshops focusing on subsets of the overall list of items to discuss in the comp plan. As you can imagine, there are many, many, many issues that one could discuss in the comp plan. And so a lot of it will be prioritizing what we've heard and finding out what some of the gaps are. So throughout the process, we've incorporated input we've heard from the community. And like I said, we've divided up the deep dive sessions into key topical areas on specific topics. We issued an online survey early in the spring. We got 500 respondents. A lot of what we heard flowed into the goals, objectives, and strategies that we distributed. And that led to how the scenarios are being built. And like I said, you won't hear all the details from all that. It's all available. We try to lift up the key ones that we thought needed the most input. But certainly we're more than happy to hear from you for others as well. So now I'm going to turn it over to Andrea.
I just realized I'm muted, so there we go.
Okay.
Thanks, Rich. Just a little bit more review here. So based on input from those early rounds of engagement, we developed key themes, and that's what you're seeing, these icons on the screen about which form the basis for the community vision. And the themes are like guiding principles reflecting an integrated way of thinking about the goals. But for the future of Newcastle County, we want a livable built environment for all. We want to focus on conservation and preservation, a robust economy, ensuring growth is sustainable, places are thriving and have community character, and certainly diverse engagement throughout. The key themes guide all of our work, but the way we've organized the goals, objectives, strategies document is around the more traditional siloed topics that you see listed here. And those are categories required for the comprehensive plan. They also organize this way around the key topics that we discussed in the deep dives. So these may be familiar, but as you'll see, as we proceed through goals, objectives, strategies work and work toward achieving the draft plan itself, these are likely to become more integrated like the themes. Okay, just a few definitions. This is what we mean by goals, objectives, strategies. It's important really to hone in on objectives tonight. You'll hear a lot of that, and strategies, but goals, naturally positive statements about what Newcastle County will be like in the future. Objectives are more specific and ideally they're quantified. Draft objectives for the plan serve as a framework for much of what we're presenting tonight, and they really bring our broad vision into specifics and specific outcomes, actually. And then strategies are defined actionable steps to be taken to achieve those goals and objectives, and they would have a specific implementing mechanism. So you kind of see this hierarchy here. We're really going to revolve around the strategies tonight. And like I said, objectives will be pointed out regularly as part of the scenario development. So noted here. The full draft of that goals, objectives, strategies document was published back in May. It's on the website, ncc2050.newcastlede.gov. And tonight we're going to focus and highlight a few key objectives. So what you see here and on the next slide, they were selected, or we selected this list based on issues that arose as high priority through the engagement process, issues that we felt like were most broadly impactful, those that we think we have most direct or likely influence, particularly as related to the land use department and county actions. And then issues that the planning team determined are quite important, most important. And lastly, those that we could directly link to the scenarios. And then a little later, I'll relate these key objectives to the scenarios for the future. So you're going to hear a lot about scenario planning and scenarios. And we'll talk about how recommended policies or strategies to achieve these objectives are likely to result in different outcomes under those different scenarios. And along with those outcomes come trade-offs. So this tool called scenario planning is used to stress test our strategies. And comprehensive planning it can be difficult because we're trying to answer questions about the future, but the future is highly uncertain. So scenario planning offers us a way to deal with that uncertainty. We're using scenarios to help us identify which policy, what we're calling dials, are most important, and then stress test different possible futures. So this diagram just speaks to that idea that at the y-axis, or the base of the x-axis, you start out with present time and things are very clear and known. And as you go out to the future, there's a range of plausible possibilities. Scenarios are based on a combination of existing conditions, projected trends, and possible policy options. Different combinations of these three things give us different stories of plausible futures. And then analyzing the outcomes of those stories help us understand the trade-offs of different strategies and identify how the strategies may present opportunities or challenges depending on how the future unfolds. So that's why, the importance of all of this that you're going to hear about tonight. It's a lot of important work that was done, and we have to boil it down given the constraints of time. As we conducted our analysis, it became clear there were 3 elements that most affect the difference in outcomes of our scenarios. And these elements include a combination of different assumptions about expected trends, as well as different policy actions. The 3 important scenario dials are economic growth, shown here as dials in green, jobs housing balance, they're in the middle as yellow dial, and compact development as another dial. And we call these dials because in the scenarios, we're testing different possibilities for the future by changing our assumptions associated with each of those. We can thereby kind of turn the dials up or down. Later, we're going to talk about how specific strategies relate to each of these dials. And then the next part of this presentation will give you an overview of the building blocks for the scenarios. So existing conditions, that and trends is one of the most important parts of the county scenario development. Part of that is population, economic conditions, land use, and development patterns, as well as infrastructure and travel patterns. So that's kind of foundational. And over the next 30 years, as you see here in this chart, the population is projected to stay relatively flat. Employment is actually projected to decrease slightly. However, worth noting, this data comes from the Delaware Population Consortium, and we're required to use it as they're kind of considered official projections in planning. But like I said, we can't predict the future. So our scenario planning work is a way that we can look at what could happen within a range of different possible and plausible population and employment conditions. Population is projected to grow slightly in the middle and southern parts of the county. So the map on the left highlights those areas in yellow. And then jobs actually are projected to grow, or I should say fall rather, in northern parts of the county. When I say fall, locate. And so those areas are shown in blue. Based on those existing conditions and projected trends, we can summarize several trends that seem more certain, those are on the left here, and some that are a little less certain, but these are factors of change important to keep in mind as we plan for the future. So just to kind of call out some of these, overall job growth is expected to be negative, no guarantees, but part of that story is shrinking manufacturing sector, possible increases in retail, transportation and warehousing has certainly, we've seen an upward tick in that. Real estate, the financial insurance and real estate sector, and then healthcare also. Some parts of the county economy where there's some growth. An increasing portion of workers are expected to be in the gig economy, and maybe we feel that especially over the last year. With that would be less stability and fewer employer-related benefits. Certainly the population is aging, diversifying, and with that comes different preferences for housing. Infrastructure is aging, and that can lead to increased maintenance costs. And certainly climate change is right at our door. If not already, it's happening, of course, and we don't know the full impacts of that. We also don't know exactly all these technological changes that we're facing in terms of transportation technology, energy, and there are also significant increases or decreases in immigration that are possible, and those things are based on, of course, national policy as well as global economics, so those are hard to predict. While we can't control the population and employment changes that come from some of these less certain forces, we do have the local policies that we can impact, and where that helps us impact where we grow and what that pattern will be, a focus of conversation tonight. So this is a complex graphic here, which is intentional to a degree. On the left, you see the key objectives. And this diagram is intended to show you how those key objectives relate to those scenario dials you see in the second column, green, yellow, and red. And then there are these other strategies that relate to more than one outcome. So sequentially from left to right is kind of how we're presenting this tonight. You see that many strategies relate to more than one outcome, and keep that in mind as we get ready for the small group discussion, because that's when we'll be discussing different strategies and trade-offs. And before I turn it over to Dan, this graphic really sums up the way we defined our 4 scenarios with the components or dials that we've been able to use to kind of turn things up and down. So along the bottom are the names and abbreviations we're using. Then you see the gray and the blue rows representing existing conditions, expected trends. Those are foundational and they happen across all of the scenarios. One level up, you've got sub-area plans, those represented in the blue color. Those are assumed for scenarios 1B, 2A, and 2B. Additional economic growth falls into the 2A and 2B scenarios. Dan's going to explain more of this, so I'm just giving you an overview. And then lastly, the 2B option, more compact growth, also has more policy change associated with it. And just also note those colors. 2B is associated with that pink color. So as you see the next set of slides, you can kind of color code those as well. 2A is red, 1B is blue, and then 1A is the navy blue color. So now we're going to go into the 4 scenarios, and Dan.
Great, thanks, Andrea. So I'm going to present 4 slides that look fairly similar that put both a map and some words to those building blocks and the description of the scenario dials on the left-hand side. And the first scenario that we're calling 1A, the dark blue, as you've already seen, we're calling it formally business as usual. Another term that we've talked about is maybe it's the wilting rose, because as Andrea pointed out, this is a case where we have fewer jobs over the next 30 years than we have today. So there is some economic stagnation, if you will. But that does reflect the adopted countywide econometric forecast, that first dial. It also reflects what's already adopted for community level forecasts. And it reflects that we're not assuming here any changes to the current regulatory environment or incentives that might be applied to how we grow. And notably, again, what we're using this acronym of CAMP for the community area master plans, that in this case, it would say we walk away from the work that's been done so far and don't adopt those plans that are already underway. Scenario 1B on the next slide basically takes that same scenario, but does include adopting and implementing the area master plans, those camps, and they're shown now on the screen. So 4 of them north of the canal, and then southern Newcastle County south of the canal. And again, you'll see that each of those 3 scenario dials, those first 3 bullets, we've put the word camp in there. We're going to achieve the objectives of those plans as they are currently working their way through the system, but we're still not going to assume any other changes to the regulatory or incentive environment, which is really the how we grow kind of at a site level. In the third scenario, we're looking a little bit more optimistically at the total econometric growth. And again, as Andrea mentioned, we don't have a lot of control over global or national trends, but we do have some influence over that. And it provides us a real opportunity to stress test what happens if we have that growth. And there's some ideas there that, one thing we could be doing to provide some growth back to that rose is perhaps reestablishing kind of the global biochemistry leadership role. Really working towards directing additional growth towards places that have infrastructure, still achieving those area master plans that are still shown on the slide here. But in 2A, we're saying we get that growth, but that we are still not doing more than the area master plans to try and direct the where and how we grow. So that additional growth still kind of gets spread throughout the county according to the market as it exists today. And then finally, scenario 2B takes that same level of growth and basically keeps kind of those area-wide econometric ideas, but does identify some new focus areas that are showing up in purple that maybe that will be the subject of more dialogue. Some of these may turn into the next generation of master plans, depending in part upon what we hear from you all tonight. But the real goal is that throughout the county, there are more planning and zoning policies that could be implemented to focus on more compact growth countywide. So again, the next slide, while our focus is not really on the scenarios themselves, but how the scenarios relate to strategies and to outcomes, this is just a little bit of another summary in terms of those three dials we've described. Economic growth is really the how much we grow. The jobs housing balance is a surrogate for the where we grow and how we bring jobs and housing together. And the compact development is really the how we grow. And you can kind of see the stepping stones again, that low doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means it's where we are today. And then we're turning those dials up to either a moderate level or a high level as we step through each of those four scenarios. So now I'm going to turn it back to Andrea to talk a little bit about how these scenarios then relate to the strategies and outcomes that we'll talk more about in breakout sessions.
Thanks. So touching back to the point made earlier about implementation mechanisms, on the left, you see here the 2012 future land use map, and it's what is in the current comp plan used today. At right is a concept of what the next future land use map might look like. And it, for purposes of this slide, you don't need to be able to read all the detail. We actually have another slide coming up where Rich will elaborate on this. What we're talking about tonight will help us as we draft this future land use map, as well as other parts of the draft plan that will be shared later this fall. And so the key choices we have to make are really about where to grow and what kind of pattern. In the first forum, you might remember we asked about what patterns of growth you like and don't like for the future of Newcastle County, and this slide shows you what the results were. The comp plan has to be something the county can implement, and the comprehensive plan addresses a wide range of topics, but there are only a few general strategies that we can use to make changes in any of the policy areas. So these types of strategies that are listed here can give you ideas as we talk more specifically about the identified strategies for achieving the plan's objectives, as well as the trade-offs associated with those strategies. Worth noting is that some strategies are more directly under the land use department and others require more extensive collaboration with other agencies, organizations, and departments. Okay, so based on the list of the key objectives, we generated a list of related indicators, and that's the column you see here on the left. The column on the right shows some examples of the ways we can measure them. So this next series of slides will explain sort of what our analysis of the scenarios found. So we explored the likely outcomes of the recommended strategies in the context of the scenarios, and the results can help us compare different options and understand those trade-offs.
So the next slide, I'll start introducing some of the scenario outcomes, and you'll see several slides. Let's move to the next slide, the first of several slides that are alike. And on each of these slides, we've basically put together a little chart on the right-hand side that shows the metric that we're considering or the outcome we're considering and how those scenarios 1A through 2B fall kind of on a county level and how the future forecasts compare to where we are today in 2020. On the left-hand side are some of the key strategies that would help us achieve these objectives, and we'll talk more about those in the breakout sessions. Many of these outcomes have a sort of direction, as you saw before on the objectives. Maybe going up is good, going down is good. It depends upon the objective. And balancing jobs and housing is a little bit nuanced because the goal here is to match the number of jobs to the number of residents that want jobs. And generally 1.6 is basically a balanced jobs housing ratio because it reflects the fact that typically in a typical household, there are about 1.6 people on average that are looking for a job. And you can see that in 2020, as well as in our scenarios 1A and 1B that have fairly little growth, that they are a little bit resident heavy. There are not as many jobs for the people that want jobs. And then in our 2A, 2B scenarios, we are much more balanced. So that's just one way of thinking about the countywide totals. It's worth pointing out that in each of the individual area master plans, they do not all follow that same trend towards seeking more jobs, because not only is balance at a countywide level valuable, but balance at a community level is valuable too. So while a southern Newcastle County may also be right now residence heavy, other areas such as Route 202 or Churchman's are already job centers. And so some of the strategies in individual plans may be increasing the ratio of residential to jobs in specific areas.
Before I mention details on this slide, I just wanted to say you're going to see a summary here, and there's a lot more detail behind all of this work tonight. We're going to be putting materials up on the website and sharing them with you. They'll be available where you can actually go and learn more about what's behind this, this analysis work. So if you're really interested in details, that will be available to you. So achieving the objectives for increasing diversity of housing options needs to include more variety in housing costs, sizes, and also densities, as well as greater distribution of choices in different parts of the county. Variety makes it easier for people to match their housing needs to what is available. And so strategies considered toward achieving this objective include things like detached accessory dwelling units by right as an option in all residentially zoned areas, basing standards on design and form versus the number of units, and including affordable units in all major developments. Scenario 2B, so as you see on the bubble diagram, which assumes more compact growth, shows the most increase in housing diversity, while scenario 1A, with lower growth and current policies, shows lower housing diversity. And then of course there's the 2020, sort of where we are today, shown in the middle. Strategies associated with the objective of increasing access to parks and open space include things like land use and transportation design that supports safe and comfortable non-motorized facilities, especially in areas for infill and growth. Also developing a countywide long-range parks master plan is another example. So outcomes associated with this, scenarios with more policy change, and that would be 1B and 2B, show improvements in non-motorized access to parks and open space, while scenarios with current policy show access to parks and open space actually getting slightly worse. Aside from required open space that gets protected through new development, the other primary way of meeting the objective of increasing protected land is through purchase of land or development rights. Other strategies such as partnerships with agencies and other organizations on land or easement purchase, as well as transfer of development rights are other examples. So outcomes, the scenario 1B and 2B would likely reduce public costs for land preservation toward achieving the objective of 30% preservation of land. Worth noting, this comparison of those scenarios looked at how well subdivision development would achieve community open space, and while we would generally expect infill growth emphasized in those scenarios 1B and 2B to lead to less fragmented open space and better land protection, you know, the leveraging of funding to preserve land is really something that could be applied to any of the scenarios. So think of that strategy as something that's a little disconnected from any of the scenarios when we discuss this in the breakout groups.
So one of the goals is to reduce the amount of impervious surface, which helps deal with stormwater management and water quality and quantity. And the first strategy we have here relates to parking space requirements. And the reason for that is while today about 1/7 of the county's land is paved, more than half of that paved land is due to parking. And that's particularly an issue with commercial development, but it also applies to residential development as well. So one of the things we could be doing to reduce impervious surface is to be changing the parking space requirements. We could also be promoting mixed-use development, which helps reduce the amount of buffer or paved buffer between different developments. And finally, for all development, really incenting what's called low impact design, which is an acronym that really gets at a whole series of things that include better stormwater management and green roofs and things like that. And what you kind of see in the impervious surface outcomes for the scenarios is really that the difference between 2A and 2B, which both have more economic growth, so more jobs and housing than we have either today or in the 1A, 1B, but with the local policies, we can actually reduce our impervious surface beyond or below what we have today while still accommodating more growth. The next slide turns a look at kind of operating and how people get around. And again, the vehicle miles of travel is a useful metric for a whole bunch of other elements of efficiently using the transportation infrastructure that we have built. Again, key strategies here are to promote mixed-use development, which provides opportunities for shorter trips, to strengthen the umbrella of things called transportation demand management, generally policies, projects, and services that again provide options for people to make travel choices. And again, you see the reduced parking availability in places where you have alternative travel options and they're available to people. And that same pattern kind of applies that with the localized kind of policies in 2B, we're able to really make some progress in reducing vehicle miles of travel. That links a little bit to one of the objectives, which is greenhouse gas emissions. And here we're showing the same vehicle miles of travel outcome because that's something that we can measure. Vehicle miles of travel generally generates about 1/3 of carbon emissions, which is the key greenhouse gas that gets measured. But there are a lot of additional strategies that could be applied beyond VMT to get at the 2/3 of carbon generation. And these are things that can certainly be applied to new development, but can also be applied to existing development and even to existing personal choices, such as the design of the buildings that we live in. There's an acronym there, LEED, that many of you know is Leadership for Energy and Environmental Design. Looking at clean energy sources, relying more on hydro as solar contrasted to coal. Reducing just the amount of consumption that people use, again, at a corporate or a personal level. And then those are all things that are looking to reduce the amount of carbon generated. We can also be looking at ways to increase the amount of carbon sequestered or captured, such as reducing the amount of trees that are cut down or planting more trees through afforestation.
So these last two objectives are more overarching, and they're also maybe arguably more complex to analyze. The objective of fiscal sustainable development is about achieving a future where the public or community revenue meets or exceeds the public costs to provide services and infrastructure to that development. And another important point, maintaining those, especially infrastructure over time. So it's complex in part because of the complexities of public finance and the way different infrastructure and services are provided here in the county by different levels of government and other ways. But using analysis by a firm that specializes in fiscal impact and cost of land use, we looked at fiscal comparison of a business as usual approach, which would probably be associated with our option 1A or our scenario 1A rather, versus something more compact and mixed use. We did that in two sub areas of the county, and those two areas are community area master plan areas, North Claymont, Churchman's Crossing. And this chart shows you in blue, the outcome of business as usual, and in orange, the outcome that was found for a more compact mixed use approach. Net fiscal impact is basically public revenue minus costs. And the result is more rosy for the compact scenarios over those more business as usual. Certainly, this doesn't represent a countywide understanding of this issue, and it's much bigger than this, but it can help us in discussion about how our different scenarios and strategies would be likely to impact fiscal situation. And then equity, a huge issue, and it's also complex and extends well beyond the ability of the comprehensive plan to fully achieve equity, but nonetheless, the comprehensive plan is a part of achieving equitable communities. So here you see a few charts showing data on race. Race is one way of looking at equity. And these three charts look at trends over the last 30 years. So at left is just basically the population change. And at right are two different variables, unemployment and then home ownership. So a few things to point out about that. And this is very high level. Again, with constraints of time, we can't do this, we can't do the full detail presentation, but certainly important. Population's becoming browner, and the trends for those two indicators that we've shown seem to be moving in the right direction, but it's important to note there's still disparities, both in homeownership and unemployment. And there are nuances that have to be explored further. So this doesn't tell the whole story for sure. And the other thing to note is race is one example that we chose, but achieving equity involves other aspects of the population: age, income, disability access, and others. So as we move forward measuring and tracking data and progress on the indicators across subpopulations is really an important way of improving equity through the comprehensive plan. Okay, so we've illustrated how different strategies result in different possible outcomes, and those are connected to our goals and objectives. And now we're going to give you a couple of hypothetical examples of how some of these strategies get implemented through the future land use map and corresponding zoning changes. And that's a key part of plan implementation. So Rich. Make sure you unmute.
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you, Andrea. So like Andrea said, we want to give you a couple hypothetical examples that are in the county, however, just to really illustrate this concept, because the future land use map is really, like we said, one of the key parts of implementation. And obviously, if we're going to take all this time and effort to build and hopefully get the plan adopted, we actually want to implement it. So the way the state law sets up the plans in the state of Delaware, the future land use map really drives one of the main ways you implement it, which is through zoning and subdivision regulations and other related tools, policy tools in the county. Also, it's a good communication tool to show what the future land use categories should be, and then those drive, like I said, different zoning categories. Land use categories tend to be a little more general than specific zones. But what you see here is a map of an area down near Delaware City, an area that we're seeing change in land use, change in market, change in what people want to see grow down there. So also the other thing to note is that the future land use map is really supposed to reflect what we're weighing and trying to see in the scenarios, and then therefore the correspondingly the recommendations, those flow into how we build the future land use map. One of the things I want to point out is in many cases in the county, it's been fairly easy to incrementally change the future land use map through rezonings. The county from time to time will do a rezoning for a specific project for a specific parcel in a piecemeal kind of fashion. And those projects in isolation might be fine. It depends on how people feel about any one particular rezoning. And then the future land use map for that specific property is has been changed a little bit, almost as an afterthought. What we're really hoping is different in this comprehensive plan that we build is that the future land use map will have a stronger status, and it'll drive rezonings as opposed to the other way around. That's the way it's supposed to work, but instead of the other way around where people think about what they want, incremental, piecemeal rezonings, and then the land use map is changed after the fact. We really want the future land use map to drive the land use policy and to be very, make sure we set up the land use categories correctly and have an appropriate level of flexibility within them, but then think very judiciously about when and how we change the future land use map. So that's a big part of discussions we'll continue to have about how we implement this plan. And so here's the area, like I said, to the west of Delaware City. And the next slide is showing you it's showing you the future land use designation, the current future land use. So it has a little contradiction in terms, current future land use, but the current comprehensive plan we're under right now today is 2012. That's why we're looking to update our plan in the year 2022, hence the 10-year update. So the current active future land use category is right there. That's for low density residential in the yellow there. You can see the canal just below it. And then you see that the zoning is suburban, also known as the S zone. So land use category was low density residential. That manifests itself in the zoning in the UDC as the suburban zone. Next slide, please. Something to consider going through the planning process is that you can see on the top there that there might be some consideration on the upper part, that kind of grayish, no, not the gray, but the sort of blue-gray color there. Perhaps there's a transition zone that we consider. Again, this is just an illustration, hypothetical illustration to get us thinking about how we take these concepts and morph them to evolve them into a future land use map, thinking about how we may want to change. Some land use categories may not change, but for those where the plan, the work, the recommendations of the plan suggest change, something like a transition zone there, instead of it being S, maybe it should be commercial office, and having that adjacent to the industrial uses just adjacent to it. Next slide, please. And then the zoning could correspond to that, like a light industrial type zone going, again, you change the future land use category first, and then the zoning follows. And that's a very sort of simple initially, but really key thing to keep in mind as we go forward. So in this hypothetical example, you know, perhaps changing from S to a transition area where it's more commercial, and then perhaps maintaining some S south of it. So you have that buffer in between. I'm going to do one more example. This one's a little more fine-grained, if you will. Certainly a more urban part of the county. This is Churchman's Crossing area. We currently have a sub-area plan effort going on there. It's a transportation plan working with DelDOT and Wilmapco. This is the area where the Christiana Mall is. It's where Christiana Hospital. It's a fairly busy area, and realizing this is an area we really need to focus because it has a lot of jobs as well. So it's going to continue to grow, and we want to grow there as smart sustainability as possible. So a lot of attention currently is focused on transportation issues there and how things are connected, but also when you think about the land use. So this is right here, the current future land use map for the area, and going forward, and you can see a lot of different categories there of mix of commercial and office, industrial land, as well as residential. This is a conceptual map. Again, rough draft, just conceptual of how some of that might change through the work of those working on the plan. And so what it does, it simplifies some of the residential designations, identifies existing neighborhoods as developed, and it also simplifies some of the business categories for business flex districts, as it said, for most of the non-residential uses in the area, except for some of those that might be more intense. It's also intended to support economic activity, offer flexibility, and accommodate rapidly changing market demand. And lastly, on this map, it's corridor designations to further define aspects of desired land use for some of those areas along the corridors in the area. And then the next thing I want to finish up here with this is some parts of the county are either dense enough or the issues are fine-grained enough. We might need a little more than perhaps your general land use categories may give us for parts of the county. The county is a very diverse county in all ways that you can think of diversity, including land use. So in an area such as Churchman's Crossing, where transportation, that mix of transportation and land use is so critical. It's important everywhere, but especially in a place like Churchman's. May need more detailed future land use map to enable some more advanced planning tools, things like form-based zoning that gets more at what the buildings are shaped and look like than just focusing just on the land use. Other provisions that come a little bit more unique and customized, smart code provisions, transit-oriented development, trying to take advantage of the transportation infrastructure that's there and perhaps planned there. And also, this is truly an area where you want mixed-use development. There's some of that there already, but it's really an area that speaks out for mixed-use development. So what you might think of as this is a little bit of future land use effort plus. It might need more detailed planning than maybe some other parts of the county may necessitate. I'm turning it back over to Jennifer now.
Well, before we move into our breakout groups, which we are doing very shortly now so we can hear from all of you, I want to give you just a short explanation of what you will be discussing. So one primary question we have is where and in what pattern should we grow? You go to the next slide. This map is a map that you will see in your breakout groups, and what it shows is it highlights areas of the county where this planning analysis suggests that there is the strongest pressure or opportunity for growth. You see those areas highlighted in the purple. The beige areas are the areas that have had a master plan completed or almost completed in process. The completed community area master plans, all of them except Churchman's Crossing, have been added to an ordinance that would formally adopt them as part of the comprehensive plan. And that ordinance will be considered by the council in the next few months. But tonight you're going to use this base map in your small groups to discuss where and how you think the county should grow, either in population or jobs. For tonight's discussion, we really want to focus on the areas that don't have a completed community master plan, those areas that are shown in purple without the beige highlighting on top of it. Of course, if there's enough time in your group, you can talk about all of the areas, but the purple areas here haven't had a lot of discussion, and the beige areas have had community discussion. Now, all of these materials, this map that you're going to be using in your small groups is also going to be available individually for you to go back to later and add any individual comments you want to make. We have people in the small groups who are taking notes about the discussion, and we'll be recording that discussion tonight, but you'll also have the opportunity to individually go on later and add your comments. Next slide, please. So we anticipate that those purple areas on the map will have some changes coming. And one of the things we want to talk about with you tonight is what kind of change should happen in those areas. And we've identified 3 potential development types to talk about. One is mixed residential, which is an area that has a variety of housing types, primarily residential.
Sorry, can we, Jennifer, somebody needs to mute themselves. We can hear. So just please make sure that you're muted.
I'll mute everyone and then unmute myself.
Thanks.
All right. So we have 3 different types of development. Mixed residential, which has a variety of housing types. It's primarily residential, but it may have some small neighborhood commercial. That's shown in the top row there. Town village center, which is like a traditional main street or a small town downtown. The form of development supports a mix of uses and a mix of travel modes, encouraging walking, biking, and transit. And then economic hub is an area that's focused on jobs and commercial uses. And it could have a mix of office or light industrial, manufacturing, warehousing, and retail. Now note that these types we're just talking about for those purple areas that we really expect there to be substantial change happening. All of the areas on the map that are shown in white, our anticipation is that they would remain largely the way they are today. Some of those areas are, suburban subdivisions with large houses. Some of them are agricultural fields. Everything in white on the map is anticipated to stay largely the same. Now, one of our questions in the breakout room is which types go in which of these intended change areas. So your group is going to spend about half of your discussion time looking at this map and commenting on it. And then you will move on to discussing specific potential strategies, that some of those strategies that Andrea and Dan discussed when they were talking about the objectives and the measurements. Every strategy has some pros and cons. Every single one has some pros and some cons. And so it's important for us to really explore your ideas about those trade-offs and what trade-offs you want to make. So the second part of the discussion in your group will be focused on those questions. Those questions, again, you will also have an opportunity to complete a survey on your own to do later. Now, in your group, I really encourage you to try to cultivate an attitude of curiosity. There are probably people in your group that won't agree with you or that you won't agree with. And that is totally fine for tonight. We want to understand all of the different perspectives and not just what your opinion is or what you think, but why you think it, what's going into your reasoning behind it. And so one last reminder before I open up the breakout rooms, if you have joined this meeting on 2 different devices, there's a chance that your 2 different devices will get sent to 2 different rooms because I don't know that your devices are linked. So if you end up in a room where your video and your audio are not in the same room, just leave your room, come back to the main room, and I will then be able to help you get to the right place.
Jennifer?
Andrea? Yeah?
Yeah, I wanted to say 2 things. One, with these types or the typologies shown on the screen here, we had to, pick 3 and make this feasible for an online 60-minute discussion. But if you have other ideas for other types of things that you think should show up in certain areas, jot that into your comment as you fill out the form yourself or say it in the discussion. That's certainly on the table. The other thing is just a clarification. Jennifer, you did say Ordinance 21036, which is that comprehensive plans, community area master plan ordinance currently in progress. You said it would go to council in the next few months. Actually, it's intended to go to the planning board for public hearing in September. So I just didn't want anybody to be confused or I wanted to make sure that was heard correctly.
Yes, thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
So all of the questions that you've been talking about in the chat are up for discussion in your small group, and that's the best place to have these discussions. So we are going to go now so that we have the most time possible for discussion, and I will see you back in a bit. Hello, everyone. I will give a minute or so for everyone to get back in from the breakout rooms. They haven't quite all closed yet. And it looks like we have everyone back now. Great, thank you all. I hope you had interesting, provocative, useful discussions in your breakout rooms. I can't wait to see some of the notes and hear what you talked about. I want to thank you all for your participation tonight. We can't do this without you. There will be other ways to continue participating throughout the summer, the rest of this summer and the fall, and I want to let you know about a few of those ways. In July, so detailed content about everything that you heard tonight and an online survey form and the interactive map that you can go in and mark up and comment on your own will be available on the website later this week, and you will all be getting an email with links to that content. We encourage you to review those materials and make your comments, and also forward it on to everybody you know. The more people who are commenting on this, the better. The comments on the surveys and the map, the interactive map, are due August 8th. That will be in the email. It's prominently on the website too. And that's so we can synthesize all the information and pull it together to bring into the draft plan. Staff will use your input from tonight and from the survey and the interactive map as they complete the first full draft of this plan. In August, we will be meeting with the Interagency Working Group and the Stakeholder Advisory Committee again to consider all of the input and start reviewing pieces of the draft plan. And then over the course of the fall, pieces of the draft plan will be released, and there will be a third public forum to review that draft comment, that draft content and get comment. So please do keep your eye on your email and the website for those future ways to keep participating as these ideas get refined more and more. Andrea or Rich, do you have any closing comment you want to make for tonight?
Thanks. Just want to thank everyone for their time and working with us. You know, a little bit of a complex meeting, trying to really, our goal was to drill down and not just hear general ideas. We've been doing that for a year, and we'll continue to listen to those. But the reason we had this kind of structured approach, which I think worked in some instances better than others, was to really try to draw out, drill down, and stretch and pull and kick the tires of some of the draft recommendations that we have. So that's why we're doing that. But certainly we got still a lot of work to do. And as Jennifer said, there'll be other opportunities going forward with surveys and stakeholder advisory committee. And then there'll be certainly another forum in the fall. So thank you for your time and have a great night.
Thank you, everybody.